An elderly man in worn clothing and scuffed shoes shuffles toward first class on Flight 447, clutching a simple canvas bag. Flight attendant Jessica Sterling, impeccably dressed in her crisp uniform, watches with growing disgust. She spent 5 years building her reputation as the airline's most discerning crew member, pride herself on maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that first-class passengers expect. When the old man settles into seat 2 amperes, Jessica's jaw tightens. This vagrant clearly doesn't belong among the wealthy businessmen and socialites. She approaches with her practiced professional smile, ready to escort this obvious mistake back to economy where he belongs. But as she demands to see his ticket, the old man simply looks up with calm, knowing eyes. Jessica has no idea that her next words will change everything, and that this nobody holds the power to ground her career forever. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Robert Mitchell adjusted the worn collar of his faded gray cardigan as he shuffled through the bustling corridors of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, his canvas sneakers squeaking softly against the polished terminal floor. At 73 years old, his weathered hands gripped a simple canvas messenger bag that had seen better decades, its frayed edges and coffee stains telling stories of countless journeys. To every passing traveler, he appeared to be nothing more than another elderly man navigating the chaos of modern air travel. Perhaps a retired teacher or factory worker visiting grandchildren in Miami. They had absolutely no idea that this unassuming figure in second-hand jeans and scuffed shoes owned the very airline they were flying on today. Robert had deliberately chosen this modest attire for Flight 447, part of his quarterly ritual of traveling incognito to witness firsthand how his employees treated passengers when they believed no one important was watching. 40 years earlier, Robert had started his career in aviation as a baggage handler for a small regional carrier, working double shifts to support his young family while dreaming of something greater. He remembered the ache in his shoulders from loading countless suitcases, the sting of winter wind cutting through his thin uniform jacket, and, most importantly, the way passengers sometimes looked right through him as if he were invisible. Those memories had shaped every decision he made when building Sterling Airlines from a single aircraft operation into one of the nation's most respected carriers. Unlike the corporate executives who inherited their positions or climbed ladders through boardroom politics, Robert understood the airline business from the ground up. Literally, he knew that the true measure of an airline's quality wasn't found in the glossy brochures or first-class amenities, but in how every single employee treated every single passenger, regardless of their appearance, destination, or ticket price. Today's undercover evaluation would take him from Chicago to Miami in the first-class cabin he had personally designed to reflect understated elegance rather than ostentatious luxury. As he approached the gate, Robert felt the familiar mix of anticipation and concern that accompanied these secret assessments. Would his flight attendants demonstrate the values of respect and dignity he had tried so hard to instill throughout the company culture? Or would he discover once again that some employees had forgotten the fundamental truth that had guided his entire career? Every passenger deserves to be treated with humanity and kindness, because you never truly know who they are or what their story might be. Jessica Sterling smoothed her perfectly tailored navy blazer and checked her reflection in the galley mirror for the third time in 10 minutes, ensuring that every strand of her professionally highlighted blonde hair remained precisely in place within her regulation chignon. At 28 years old, she had spent the last 5 years cultivating what she considered to be the gold standard of flight attendant excellence, and today's first-class service on Flight 447 would be no exception to her unwavering commitment to maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that distinguished Sterling Airlines from its competitors. She adjusted the small diamond earrings that complemented her crisp white blouse, then inspected her manicured French-tipped nails for any imperfections that might detract from the polished image she worked so meticulously to project. Jessica believed wholeheartedly that first-class passengers paid premium prices not just for wider seats and better meals, but for an elevated experience that began the moment they stepped into her domain, and she took immense pride in her ability to instantly assess which travelers truly belonged in the forward cabin versus those who had somehow stumbled into territory far above their natural station in life. She gathered her junior crew members around the galley counter, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she had perfected through countless flights as the lead attendant. "Remember, we are the guardians of the first-class experience," she declared, her eyes scanning each face to ensure her message was being properly received. "Our passengers expect a certain level of sophistication and refinement, and it is our responsibility to maintain those standards at all times. We must be observant and proactive in addressing any situations that might compromise the comfort or expectations of our valued customers." As passengers began boarding, Jessica positioned herself strategically at the entrance to the first-class cabin, her practiced smile masking the sharp analytical mind that was already categorizing each arriving traveler based on their clothing, luggage, and overall presentation. When she spotted an elderly man in a threadbare cardigan and worn jeans shuffling toward the premium section, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed with immediate concern. This disheveled figure with his scuffed canvas shoes and faded messenger bag was clearly lost, probably confused about his seat assignment and wandering into an area where he absolutely did not belong. Jessica's jaw tightened as she watched him settle into seat 2. Her mind already formulating the tactful but firm approach she would need to take to redirect this obvious mistake back to the economy section where people of his apparent circumstances belonged. She had encountered these situations before, and her reputation for handling them with professional efficiency had earned her recognition from management and gratitude from first-class passengers who appreciated her dedication to preserving their exclusive environment. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 epitomized the sophisticated elegance that Sterling Airlines had become renowned for, with its cream leather seats arranged in spacious pods that provided both privacy and commanding views of the clouds below. In Seat 1B, a distinguished businessman in a charcoal Armani suit spoke quietly into his platinum-cased phone about a merger that would reshape the telecommunications industry, his Italian leather briefcase positioned precisely beside his polished Oxford shoes. Across the aisle, a socialite with perfectly coiffed silver hair adjusted her Hermes scarf while reviewing documents for a charity gala, her Louis Vuitton carry-on bag displaying the subtle luxury that marked her as someone accustomed to the finer things in life. The gentle murmur of refined conversations filled the cabin as passengers discussed vacation homes in the Hamptons, wine collections, and business ventures that involved figures most people could barely comprehend, their voices carrying the confident cadence of individuals who had never questioned their right to occupy spaces like this one. In stark contrast to this tableau of wealth and sophistication, Robert Mitchell sat quietly in Seat 2A, his weathered hands carefully extracting a dog-eared paperback novel from his faded canvas messenger bag, the book's spine cracked from countless readings and its pages yellowed with age. The woman in Seat 3A, adorned in designer jewelry that caught the cabin lighting with every subtle movement, glanced over at Robert with barely concealed bewilderment, her expression suggesting she had encountered something completely out of place in her carefully curated world. A tech executive in Seat 4B whispered something to his companion about declining standards, their disapproving glances, making it clear that Robert's presence was registering as an unwelcome disruption to the exclusive atmosphere they had paid handsomely to enjoy. From her position in the forward galley, Jessica Sterling felt her professional composure beginning to crack as she observed the growing discomfort rippling through her precious first-class cabin, the tension building like storm clouds gathering before an inevitable downpour. She leaned closer to her colleague Marcus, a junior flight attendant who had always respected her expertise in handling delicate passenger situations, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper that carried undertones of barely controlled frustration. "Do you see what is happening in 2A?" she hissed, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the galley counter as her eyes remained fixed on Robert's unassuming figure. "This is exactly the kind of situation that compromises the entire first-class experience for our legitimate passengers. We have people who pay thousands of dollars for this level of service, and now they are having to share their space with someone who clearly does not understand the standards we maintain up here." Jessica Sterling felt her stomach tighten with each passing moment as she watched the distinguished passengers in her first-class cabin casting increasingly uncomfortable glances toward Seat 2A, their refined features registering the kind of subtle displeasure that threatened to unravel everything she had worked so meticulously to build over her 5 years of impeccable service. She approached the businessman in seat 1B with her most apologetic smile, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who had dedicated her career to damage control in delicate situations. "Mr. Hartwell, I want to personally ensure that your flight experience meets the exceptional standards you have come to expect from Sterling Airlines," she said, her eyes darting meaningfully toward Robert's slouched figure as he turned another page of his worn paperback novel, completely oblivious to the growing storm of disapproval surrounding him. The businessman, Richard Hartwell, looked up from his platinum-encased phone with the weary expression of someone accustomed to disappointment in service industries that had once maintained higher standards. "I must say, Jessica, I am rather surprised to see the apparent decline in passenger screening for the first-class cabin," he replied, his cultured voice carrying just enough volume to ensure his words would reach other passengers who might share his concerns. "When I pay premium prices for this level of service, I expect to be surrounded by individuals who understand and appreciate the exclusivity that these accommodations represent." Jessica felt her professional composure beginning to fracture as she realized that her reputation as the airline's most discerning flight attendant was under direct threat from this vagrant who had somehow infiltrated her domain. She moved to seat 3A, where the elegantly dressed socialite was pretending to read a fashion magazine while stealing disapproving glances at Robert's scuffed canvas shoes and faded denim. "Mrs. Patterson, please accept my sincere apologies for any discomfort you might be experiencing during today's flight," Jessica whispered, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "I want you to know that I am personally monitoring the situation and will take appropriate action to ensure that all of our valued passengers can enjoy the refined atmosphere they deserve." The socialite nodded, knowingly, her diamond bracelet catching the cabin lighting as she gestured subtly toward Robert. "I certainly hope so, dear," she murmured, her tone suggesting that Jessica's professional credibility hung in the balance of how effectively she could resolve this embarrassing breach of first-class standards. Jessica felt her heart racing as she realized that every moment Robert remained in seat 2 represented another crack in the carefully constructed image she had spent years building, and the growing whispers among passengers made it clear that her ability to maintain order and exclusivity in the forward cabin was being questioned by the very people whose approval defined her success. Jessica Sterling took a deep breath and smoothed her blazer one final time before approaching seat 2A, her face arranged in the perfectly calibrated expression of professional courtesy that had served her so well throughout her career, though beneath the surface her nerves felt like live wires crackling with barely contained frustration. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that masked deeper concerns. "I hope you are enjoying your flight experience with us today. I wonder if I might take just a moment to verify your boarding documentation, purely as a routine matter of ensuring all of our passengers are properly accommodated." Robert Mitchell looked up from his weathered paperback novel, his calm gray eyes meeting Jessica's gaze with the patient expression of someone who had encountered countless difficult situations throughout his long life. Without a word, he reached into his canvas messenger bag and produced a boarding pass that clearly indicated seat 2A in the first-class cabin, the paper slightly creased from being folded but otherwise completely legitimate. Jessica accepted the document with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly as she examined every detail with the intensity of a forensic investigator, turning it over multiple times and holding it up to the cabin lighting as if searching for evidence of forgery or fraud. She murmured, her brow furrowing with exaggerated concern as she continued her theatrical inspection. "There seems to be some sort of irregularity here that I need to investigate further. Sometimes our computer systems experience glitches that can result in passengers being assigned seats that may not be entirely appropriate for their particular travel needs." Robert waited patiently as Jessica continued her charade, his expression remaining serene despite the obvious nature of her manufactured crisis. "Sir, I wonder if you might be more comfortable in one of our economy-class seats," Jessica continued, her tone becoming increasingly patronizing as she gestured vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft. "You see, the first-class cabin has certain expectations and protocols that some passengers find rather overwhelming or unfamiliar. The atmosphere up here tends to cater to a very specific clientele who are accustomed to particular standards of dress, conversation, and general deportment. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to what she imagined was a caring whisper, but came across as deeply condescending. I would hate for you to feel out of place or uncomfortable among passengers who might have different backgrounds or expectations than what you are used to. Sometimes people find that the economy section offers a much more relaxed and welcoming environment where they can truly enjoy their flight without feeling like they need to conform to unfamiliar social conventions. Robert Mitchell folded his boarding pass carefully and placed it back in his canvas messenger bag, his movements deliberate and unhurried as he met Jessica's expectant gaze with a quiet dignity that had carried him through 4 decades of building an airline from nothing into something extraordinary. Thank you for your concern, he said, his voice steady and respectful despite the obvious nature of her attempts to relocate him. But I am quite satisfied with my current seat assignment. I paid the full fare for this accommodation, and I intend to remain here for the duration of the flight. Jessica felt her carefully constructed professional facade beginning to crumble as this stubborn old man refused to cooperate with what should have been a simple relocation, her voice taking on a sharper edge that she normally reserved for the most difficult passengers who challenged her authority. Sir, I think you are failing to understand the gravity of this situation, she said, her tone becoming increasingly brittle as other first-class passengers turned their attention toward the developing confrontation. This is not simply a matter of where you prefer to sit. The first-class cabin operates according to certain standards of appearance and behavior that frankly seem quite foreign to someone of your particular background and circumstances. Her eyes swept dismissively over his faded cardigan and scuffed canvas shoes, her expression conveying the kind of judgment that she had learned to weaponize throughout her career in customer service. I mean, just look at yourself, Jessica continued, her voice rising slightly as her frustration boiled over into open contempt. That shabby sweater, those ancient shoes, that ridiculous bag that looks like it came from a thrift store. Do you honestly believe that our premium passengers should be subjected to sharing their space with someone who clearly has no understanding of appropriate first-class attire or etiquette? The businessman in seat 1B leaned forward slightly, his face a mixture of fascination and discomfort as he witnessed Jessica's professional composure completely disintegrating before his eyes. The socialite in seat 3A clutched her pearls dramatically. Though whether from shock at Robert's defiance or Jessica's increasingly unprofessional behavior remained unclear, other passengers throughout the cabin had abandoned all pretense of minding their own business, their conversations falling silent as they watched this extraordinary breach of airline decorum unfold in real time. People like you simply do not belong in environments like this, Jessica declared, her voice now carrying the kind of venom that revealed the true nature of her character beneath the polished exterior. You lack the basic social awareness to recognize when you are completely out of your element, and your stubborn refusal to accept guidance from someone who actually understands these situations is frankly embarrassing for everyone involved. Jessica Sterling felt her last shred of professional restraint evaporate as this infuriating old man continued to defy her reasonable attempts to restore order to her first-class cabin, and she turned sharply toward the galley where Marcus was preparing beverage service with the kind of panic that comes from watching a carefully managed situation spiral completely out of control. Marcus, I need your immediate assistance with a passenger situation, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never learned to accept defeat gracefully, though the edge of hysteria creeping into her tone suggested that her usual confidence was cracking under pressure. Marcus looked up from his preparation duties with obvious reluctance, his expression showing the kind of discomfort that comes from being dragged into conflicts that could easily have been avoided through basic human decency and common sense. Jessica straightened her blazer and raised her voice to address the entire first-class cabin, her announcement carrying the theatrical quality of someone who believed she was performing a public service rather than humiliating an elderly passenger. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption to your premium flight experience, she declared, her words echoing through the cabin as passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing professional competence or a complete breakdown of airline customer service standards. We are currently dealing with a passenger who is refusing to cooperate with standard cabin protocols and whose presence is compromising the exclusive atmosphere that you have paid to enjoy." She gestured dramatically toward Robert, who continued reading his worn paperback novel with the kind of serene patience that comes from having weathered countless storms throughout a long and eventful life. "As the lead flight attendant on this aircraft, I have the full authority to relocate passengers who do not meet the established standards for first-class accommodations," Jessica continued, her voice growing louder as she warmed to her theme of righteous indignation. "When individuals clearly lack the appropriate attire, behavior, or social awareness necessary for this premium environment, it becomes my responsibility to take corrective action to protect the interests of our valued customers." Robert slowly closed his book and looked up at Jessica with eyes that reflected not anger or embarrassment, but a profound sadness that seemed to encompass something far deeper than this particular confrontation. As if he were witnessing the failure of principles he had spent decades trying to instill in others, the disappointment in his weathered features was so palpable that even some of the other first-class passengers began to shift uncomfortably, sensing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond a simple seating dispute and touched on fundamental questions of human dignity and respect. Jessica Sterling felt the intoxicating rush of absolute authority as she reached down and grasped Robert Mitchell's thin arm with her perfectly manicured fingers, her grip firm enough to communicate that this situation had moved far beyond polite negotiation into the realm of direct action that would restore proper order to her domain. "Come along now," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone typically reserved for addressing confused children or mentally impaired individuals who required firm guidance to navigate situations beyond their comprehension. "We are going to get you settled somewhere much more appropriate for someone in your circumstances, and I do not want to hear any more arguments or excuses about why you think you deserve special treatment." Robert allowed himself to be pulled from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate as he gathered his worn canvas messenger bag and placed his dog-eared paperback novel carefully inside, his face maintaining the kind of serene dignity that comes from understanding that temporary humiliation cannot diminish the fundamental worth of a human soul. Jessica tightened her grip on his arm as she began to escort him toward the curtain that separated the first-class cabin from the economy section, her voice rising to address the entire cabin with the triumphant tone of someone who believed she was delivering an important lesson about social boundaries and appropriate behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience during this unfortunate incident," she announced, her words carrying across the cabin like a proclamation of victory over chaos and disorder. "Sometimes people simply do not understand their place in the world, and they require gentle but firm guidance to help them recognize where they truly belong." The businessman in seat 1B nodded approvingly as Jessica led Robert past his row, his expression suggesting that he viewed this decisive action as exactly the kind of quality control that justified the premium prices charged for first-class accommodations. Several other passengers averted their eyes, whether from embarrassment at witnessing such a public humiliation or from discomfort at their own complicity in allowing it to unfold without intervention. The socialite in seat 3A adjusted her Hermes scarf and whispered something to her companion about the necessity of maintaining standards, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that her approval of Jessica's firm handling of the situation would be noted by other passengers. As they approached the curtain dividing the cabins, Robert maintained his quiet dignity despite the degrading nature of his treatment, his eyes reflecting not anger or resentment, but a profound sadness that suggested he was witnessing the failure of something far more important than simple customer service protocols. Jessica Sterling swept back through the curtain into the first-class cabin with the satisfied expression of someone who had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task, her shoulders squared with renewed confidence as she surveyed her restored domain, where order and propriety had been triumphantly re-established through her decisive leadership. She smoothed her blazer and adjusted her perfectly styled hair, basking in the approving nods from passengers who clearly appreciated her unwavering commitment to maintaining the exclusive standards that justified their premium ticket prices. The businessman in seat 1B caught her eye and offered a subtle thumbs-up gesture, while the socialite in seat 3A smiled warmly and mouthed the words "well done" as Jessica made her way back toward the galley, where Marcus stood frozen with obvious discomfort. Meanwhile, in the economy section, Robert Mitchell settled into his newly assigned seat with the patient grace of someone who had learned long ago that temporary setbacks often provided the most valuable insights into human character, and he quietly observed the bustling activity of flight attendants preparing for takeoff, while his mind processed everything he had witnessed during the past 30 minutes. When Marcus approached with obvious reluctance to ensure that Robert was comfortable in his new accommodations, the elderly man looked up with the same calm eyes that had remained steady throughout Jessica's theatrical performance. "Excuse me, young man," Robert said softly, his voice carrying none of the bitterness or anger that Marcus expected after witnessing such degrading treatment. "I wonder if you might have a business card or some sort of customer feedback form that I could use to document my flight experience today." Marcus felt his stomach clench with anxiety as he realized that this humiliating incident was likely to generate exactly the kind of negative publicity that could damage the airline's reputation and potentially cost him his own job. "Sir, I want to personally apologize for what just happened," he whispered, his voice heavy with genuine remorse as he glanced nervously toward the first-class cabin where Jessica was holding court among the satisfied passengers. "That behavior was completely unacceptable, and it does not represent the values that this airline is supposed to stand for." He reached into his uniform pocket and discreetly handed Robert both his business card and a customer service feedback form, his hands shaking slightly as he contemplated the potential consequences of what he had just witnessed. "Please know that not all of our employees share those attitudes," Marcus continued, his voice barely audible as he leaned closer to ensure their conversation remained private. "I hope you will consider giving us another chance to demonstrate the kind of service that our passengers truly deserve." Robert Mitchell accepted the customer service form with a gentle nod of appreciation, his weathered hands smoothing the paper against his knee as he extracted a simple ballpoint pen from his canvas messenger bag, the same unremarkable writing instrument he had carried for years during his quiet inspections of airline operations across the country. Marcus lingered nearby, ostensibly organizing overhead compartments, but actually keeping a watchful eye on the elderly passenger whose treatment had left him feeling deeply ashamed of his colleague's behavior and the airline's apparent tolerance for discriminatory conduct. Robert began filling out the form with the careful precision of someone accustomed to detailed documentation, his handwriting neat and methodical as he recorded the date, flight number, and his assessment of the service he had received during the first portion of his journey from Chicago to Miami. When he reached the signature line, he paused for a moment before writing simply R. Mitchell in the same unassuming script he had used throughout the form, then moved to the frequent flyer number section, where he carefully transcribed a lengthy sequence of digits and letters that represented his relationship with Sterling Airlines. Marcus glanced casually at the form as Robert completed it, expecting to see the typical combination of numbers that designated a standard frequent flyer account, but what he witnessed instead made his blood freeze and his eyes widen with the kind of shock that comes from suddenly realizing that everything you thought you understood about a situation was completely and utterly wrong. The number Robert had written was not just any frequent flyer account, but one of the exclusive platinum-level executive designations that Marcus had seen only a handful of times during his 3 years of employment with the airline, accounts that were reserved exclusively for board members, major shareholders, and the highest-tier customers whose business relationships with Sterling Airlines extended far beyond simple passenger service. Marcus felt his heart begin to race as the implications of what he was seeing began to cascade through his mind. Like dominoes falling in perfect sequence, each realization more terrifying than the last, as he understood that this humble, elderly man in his faded cardigan and scuffed canvas shoes was not some confused vagrant who had stumbled into the wrong section of the aircraft, but someone whose connection to Sterling Airlines ran deeper than anyone in the first-class cabin could have possibly imagined. The irony of the situation hit Marcus like a physical blow, as he realized that Jessica Sterling, in her arrogant pursuit of maintaining first-class standards, had just humiliated someone whose opinion could single-handedly determine the future of her career and possibly the careers of everyone else on the flight crew. Marcus felt his hands trembling as he hurried toward the crew station computer terminal, his mind racing with the terrifying possibility that the frequent flyer number he had glimpsed might represent something far more catastrophic than a simple case of mistaken passenger treatment. He entered his crew access code with fingers that felt numb and unresponsive, then navigated to the passenger manifest database, where he could cross-reference the information Robert Mitchell had provided on his customer feedback form. The loading screen seemed to take an eternity as Marcus glanced nervously toward the first-class cabin, where Jessica was still basking in the congratulations of passengers who remained blissfully unaware that their flight had just become the epicenter of what could potentially destroy multiple careers in a single afternoon. When the passenger information finally appeared on his screen, Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as he read the words that confirmed his worst fears. Robert Mitchell, founder and chief executive officer, Sterling Airlines, with an account designation that indicated not just platinum status but ownership-level access to every aspect of the airline's operations and customer service protocols. The computer screen seemed to blur as Marcus struggled to process the magnitude of what Jessica had just done, his mind reeling with the realization that this unassuming elderly man in his threadbare cardigan and worn canvas shoes was not some confused passenger who had wandered into the wrong section of the aircraft, but the very person who had built Sterling Airlines from a single-plane operation into one of the most respected carriers in the aviation industry. Marcus gripped the edge of the computer terminal as waves of nausea washed over him, in his professional training warring with his personal instinct for self-preservation as he contemplated the impossible choice between warning Jessica about the approaching disaster or allowing events to unfold according to their natural and inevitable conclusion. Every fiber of his being wanted to rush into the first-class cabin and pull Jessica aside before she could compound her already catastrophic mistake, but another part of his mind recognized that her behavior toward Robert Mitchell represented exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that violated every principle the airline claimed to uphold. He looked back toward the economy section where Robert sat quietly reading his worn paper book, his calm demeanor giving no indication of the storm that was about to engulf everyone who had participated in his humiliation, and Marcus realized with growing horror that this gentle elderly man held the power to end careers, terminate employment, and fundamentally reshape the entire culture of Sterling Airlines with nothing more than a single phone call to the executive offices that bore his name. As Flight 447 touched down at Miami International Airport with the gentle bump that marked the end of what had become the most consequential journey in Jessica Sterling's professional career, she busied herself with the post-flight procedures that had become second nature over her 5 years of dedicated service, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse with the devastating finality of an avalanche. Robert Mitchell waited patiently in his economy seat as passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. His calm demeanor unchanged despite the humiliating treatment he had endured, and when the aisle finally cleared enough to allow movement, he made his way slowly toward the first-class cabin, where Jessica was accepting final compliments from passengers who still believed she had handled an unpleasant situation with admirable professionalism. She looked up with her practiced smile as the elderly man approached, expecting perhaps a grudging apology or a request for assistance with his connecting flight. But instead Robert simply stood before her with the same patient expression he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Excuse me, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades learning when to speak softly and when to let actions convey the full weight of important messages. "I wanted to thank you personally for providing such an educational experience during today's flight. It has been quite illuminating to observe how some employees treat passengers when they believe no one important is watching." Jessica felt a flutter of unease at his formal tone, but maintained her professional composure as she prepared to accept what she assumed would be grudging acknowledgement of her decisive handling of the seating situation. Robert reached into his canvas messenger bag and withdrew a simple leather wallet, extracting a business card that he offered to Jessica with the same calm deliberation that had characterized all of his movements throughout the flight. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he continued, his words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would eventually become tsunami waves of consequence. "I am Robert Mitchell, and I believe you work for my airline." Jessica's eyes focused on the business card, with growing confusion that quickly transformed into absolute horror as she read the words printed in simple black letters: Robert Mitchell, founder and chief executive officer, Sterling Airlines. The blood drained from her face with such startling speed that she appeared to age 10 years in the span of 10 seconds, her perfectly manicured hands beginning to shake uncontrollably as the magnitude of her catastrophic mistake crashed over her like a collapsing building, leaving her standing amid the rubble of everything she had worked so hard to build throughout her career in customer service. Jessica Sterling opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish struggling to breathe in unfamiliar air, her mind desperately searching for words that could somehow undo the catastrophic chain of events that had led to this moment of absolute professional destruction. But every potential apology seemed inadequate in the face of what she had done to the very man who had built the airline from nothing into the respected carrier that employed her. "Mr. Mitchell, I am so incredibly sorry," she finally managed to stammer, her voice breaking with the kind of panic that comes from watching your entire career evaporate before your eyes. "I had no idea who you were. I never would have treated you that way if I had known. Please let me explain what happened. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." Robert raised his hand gently to stop her frantic stream of apologies, his expression reflecting not the anger she had expected, but something far worse, a profound disappointment that seemed to encompass not just her individual actions, but a systemic failure of the values he had tried so hard to instill throughout his organization. "Miss Sterling, I want you to understand that I am not angry with you," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had spent decades dealing with difficult situations that required wisdom rather than emotion. "But I am deeply disappointed by what I witnessed today, because your behavior represents everything that is wrong with the company culture I have been trying to change for the past 40 years. He gestured toward the empty first-class cabin where her humiliating performance had played out before an audience of passengers who had applauded her cruelty. "I conduct these undercover evaluations precisely to discover how my employees treat passengers when they believe no one important is watching, and what I observed today was a complete betrayal of every principle this airline was founded upon." Jessica felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the full weight of her actions settled upon her shoulders like a crushing burden that threatened to destroy not just her career, but her entire sense of professional identity. "The way you judged me based solely on my appearance, the contempt you showed for someone you perceived as beneath your standards, and the public humiliation you inflicted without a moment's consideration for basic human dignity, Deshra. These are not the actions of someone who understands what customer service truly means," Robert continued, his words cutting deeper than any shouting or threats could have accomplished. "However, I am not going to terminate your employment immediately, because I believe in the possibility of redemption and growth. I am offering you a choice, Miss Sterling. You can resign today and walk away from this experience having learned nothing, or you can accept the opportunity to undergo genuine transformation and discover what it really means to serve others with respect and dignity." Robert Mitchell looked directly into Jessica Sterling's tear-filled eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had spent 4 decades building something meaningful from nothing, and his voice carried the weight of profound conviction as he began to explain the fundamental principles that had guided every decision he had made since the day he first dreamed of creating an airline that would treat every passenger with dignity and respect. "Miss Sterling, when I founded this airline 40 years ago, I established 3 core values that were supposed to guide every interaction between our employees and our passengers: respect for every human being regardless of their appearance or circumstances, dignity in all of our customer service encounters, and genuine service that comes from understanding that every person who boards our aircraft deserves to be treated with kindness and consideration." His words fell like hammer blows on Jessica's already shattered composure, as she began to understand the magnitude of how completely she had failed to embody the very essence of what Sterling Airlines was supposed to represent. "I did not inherit this company from wealthy parents or build it through corporate connections and boardroom politics," Robert continued, his voice taking on the reflective tone of someone sharing deeply personal history that had shaped his entire worldview. "I started my career in aviation as a baggage handler for a small regional carrier, working double shifts in all kinds of weather, loading and unloading thousands of suitcases, while passengers walked past me as if I were completely invisible. Jessica felt her stomach clench with growing horror as she realized that her treatment of Robert had replicated exactly the kind of discrimination and dismissal that he had experienced during his own humble beginnings in the industry. I remember what it felt like to be looked through rather than looked at, to be judged based on my uniform and my job title rather than my character or my potential, Robert explained, his eyes reflecting memories of countless small humiliations that had fueled his determination to create something better. Every policy I implemented, every training program I developed, every hiring decision I made was guided by a single principle: that every human being deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of whether they are wearing an expensive suit or a threadbare cardigan, regardless of whether they are traveling in first class or economy, regardless of whether they appear to have money or power or influence. The weight of his words settled over Jessica like a suffocating blanket, as she understood that her actions had not simply violated company policy, but had betrayed the very soul of everything Sterling Airlines was supposed to stand for, in an industry too often characterized by indifference and discrimination. Robert Mitchell reached into his canvas messenger bag and withdrew a simple notebook. The same worn, leather-bound journal he had carried for years during his undercover evaluations, and wrote something quickly before tearing out the page and handing it to Jessica Sterling with the deliberate movements of someone who had given considerable thought to the consequences that would follow this extraordinary breach of fundamental customer service principles. Miss Sterling, effective immediately, you are suspended from flight duty, pending a comprehensive review of today's incident and mandatory completion of a customer service retraining program that will help you understand what it truly means to serve others with dignity and respect, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had built an entire airline on the foundation of treating people fairly, regardless of their circumstances. Jessica accepted the paper with hands that continued to shake uncontrollably, her eyes scanning the handwritten instructions that would determine the immediate future of her career. But what she found there was not the termination notice she had expected, but something far more unexpected and potentially transformative. However, I want you to understand that I am not interested in destroying your career or leaving you without hope for redemption, Robert continued, his tone softening slightly as he recognized the genuine remorse beginning to replace the panic in her expression. Instead, I'm offering you an opportunity to learn this business the same way I did, from the ground up, with a 30-day assignment to our baggage handling and ground crew operations, where you will discover firsthand what it means to be treated as invisible by passengers who judge you based on your uniform rather than your character. The irony of his proposal was not lost on Jessica, as she realized that the man she had humiliated for his simple clothing was now offering her the chance to experience exactly the kind of work that had shaped his own understanding of human dignity and service excellence. You will report to Ground Operations Supervisor Martinez at 6 o'clock Monday morning, where you will spend the next month loading luggage, cleaning aircraft, and performing all of the behind-the-scenes work that makes air travel possible, Robert explained, his words painting a picture of physical labor and humble service that represented everything Jessica had spent her career trying to avoid. During this time, you will have the opportunity to observe how passengers treat ground crew members, how your fellow employees support each other through difficult work, and most importantly, how genuine service comes from understanding that every job in this airline contributes to the safety and comfort of the people who trust us with their journeys. Jessica felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension as she contemplated this unexpected path toward possible redemption rather than certain professional destruction. As word of the extraordinary confrontation spread through the corridors and crew lounges of Sterling Airlines with the lightning speed that characterizes all truly shocking workplace revelations, employees throughout the organization found themselves grappling with the uncomfortable realization that their founder and chief executive officer had been subjected to the most degrading treatment imaginable by one of their own colleagues. Marcus felt his phone buzzing constantly throughout the remainder of his shift as fellow flight attendants, ground crew members, and even pilots reached out to verify the incredible story that Robert Mitchell had been physically removed from first class by a lead attendant who had no idea she was humiliating the very man who signed her paychecks. The tale took on almost mythical proportions as it traveled from crew member to crew member, with each retelling serving as a powerful reminder that assumptions based on appearance could lead to catastrophic consequences for anyone arrogant enough to believe they could judge a person's worth by their clothing, possessions. Captain Williams, a 30-year veteran who had known Robert since the early days of the airline's expansion, shook his head in disbelief when he heard the details of Jessica's behavior, immediately recognizing the incident as a perfect example of why their founder conducted these undercover evaluations in the first place. The story reached the executive offices within hours, where senior management realized they were facing not just an isolated incident of poor customer service, but a systemic failure of the training and cultural programs they had assumed were effectively communicating the company's core values to all employees. Meanwhile, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Robert Mitchell himself, who personally thanked him for his professionalism and kindness during an extremely difficult situation, explaining that his willingness to apologize and assist a passenger who had been mistreated represented exactly the kind of character and integrity that Sterling Airlines needed to cultivate among all of its employees. Within a week, Marcus found himself promoted to senior flight attendant with a commendation letter that would become part of his permanent personnel file, a tangible reward for demonstrating that genuine customer service means treating every passenger with dignity, regardless of circumstances. The incident became required reading in all customer service training programs, with new employees learning about the importance of treating every passenger with respect, not because they might be someone important, but because every human being deserves dignity and kindness as a fundamental right rather than something that must be earned through expensive clothing or prestigious status symbols. Flight crews throughout the Sterling Airlines network began sharing the story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions, and with veteran employees using Jessica's downfall as a teaching moment for younger colleagues who might be tempted to judge passengers based on superficial appearances rather than focusing on providing excellent service to everyone who chose to fly with their airline. 6 months after the most humbling experience of her professional life, Jessica Sterling stood once again in the crew briefing room at Sterling Airlines, but the woman who faced her colleagues bore little resemblance to the arrogant, appearance-obsessed flight attendant who had once prided herself on maintaining exclusivity through discrimination and judgment. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and soft from years of cabin service, now bore the calluses and small scars that came from 30 days of loading luggage in all kinds of weather, cleaning aircraft interiors until they sparkled, and performing the countless behind-the-scenes tasks that made air travel possible for millions of passengers. The expensive highlights in her hair had grown out during her suspension, replaced by her natural brown color that she now wore in a simple ponytail, and her uniform fit differently on a body that had been strengthened and humbled by honest physical labor, alongside ground crew members who had taught her more about genuine service than 5 years of first-class cabin experience ever could. Robert Mitchell had personally conducted her final evaluation, spending 2 hours reviewing not just her technical knowledge of safety procedures and customer service protocols, but more importantly, her fundamental understanding of what it meant to treat every passenger with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status. When he offered her reinstatement as a flight attendant, Jessica accepted with tears of gratitude and a profound sense of responsibility that extended far beyond her personal redemption, to encompass a mission of ensuring that no passenger would ever again experience the kind of humiliation she had inflicted on him. During her first flight back in the cabin, Jessica found herself drawn to passengers who might have triggered her old prejudices. An elderly woman in a threadbare coat, a young man with visible tattoos, a family whose clothes suggested they were traveling on a tight budget, but had saved for months to afford their tickets. She approached each of them with genuine warmth and attentiveness, remembering the ground crew supervisor who had told her that the true measure of customer service was not how you treated the passengers who clearly belonged in first class, but how you treated those who might never fly again if their experience was anything less than wonderful. Jessica had become one of the airline's most vocal advocates for respectful treatment of all passengers, sharing her story with new employee training classes and serving as living proof that even the most deep-seated prejudices could be overcome through genuine humility, hard work, and the kind of transformative experience that comes from understanding what it feels like to be invisible to people who judge your worth based on your uniform rather than your character. Robert Mitchell understood that Jessica Sterling's shocking behavior represented not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but a symptom of deeper cultural problems that required comprehensive systemic changes throughout every level of Sterling Airlines operations, from ground crew training facilities to executive boardrooms, where policy decisions shaped the daily experiences of millions of passengers. Within 3 months of the infamous Flight 447 incident, he had implemented mandatory respect and dignity training for every single employee, from newly hired baggage handlers to veteran pilots with decades of experience, ensuring that no one could claim ignorance about the fundamental principles that were supposed to guide every interaction with passengers, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status. The training program, developed in consultation with diversity experts and customer service specialists, included detailed case studies of discriminatory behavior and its consequences, interactive role-playing exercises that helped employees understand how their assumptions could affect passenger experiences, and most powerfully, real-world testimonials from travelers who had been mistreated because of their clothing, age, race, or other superficial characteristics that had nothing to do with their worth as human beings. Robert also established a comprehensive customer service evaluation system that included both announced and unannounced assessments, ensuring that employees understood they were being observed not just by supervisors, but potentially by the very passengers they served, creating a culture of consistent excellence rather than performative customer service that only emerged when management was visibly present. The airline implemented a zero-tolerance policy for appearance-based discrimination, with clear consequences ranging from additional training to suspension or termination, depending on the severity of the incident, and every employee handbook was updated to include explicit language about treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Jessica Sterling found herself at the center of this transformation, sharing her story with incoming employee orientation classes as a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of judging passengers based on superficial characteristics rather than focusing on providing excellent service to everyone who chose Sterling Airlines for their travel needs. Her presentations, delivered with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had experienced both the heights of professional arrogance and the depths of public humiliation, became some of the most powerful and memorable components of the new training program, helping thousands of new employees understand that genuine customer service required seeing every passenger as a valuable human being deserving of kindness and consideration. The cultural transformation that followed Jessica's downfall and redemption created ripple effects throughout the aviation industry, with other airlines quietly implementing similar training programs after witnessing the positive changes in employee behavior and customer satisfaction scores that resulted from Robert Mitchell's unwavering commitment to treating every passenger with the dignity they deserved. 2 years after the transformative incident on Flight 447, Robert Mitchell continued his practice of traveling incognito throughout the Sterling Airlines network, but now his undercover evaluations revealed a fundamental shift in company culture that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations for organizational change. During a recent flight from Denver to Boston, he watched with quiet satisfaction as a young flight attendant named Sarah approached an elderly passenger whose torn jacket and patched shoes might have once triggered the kind of discriminatory treatment that had defined Jessica Sterling's original approach to customer service. Instead of judgment or condescension, Sarah offered genuine assistance with the man's carry-on bag, engaged him in friendly conversation about his destination, and ensured he had everything needed for a comfortable flight. Treating him with exactly the same level of attention and respect she provided to the business executive in the neighboring seat. Robert had witnessed similar scenes dozens of times across different routes and crew assignments. Observing flight attendants who went out of their way to assist passengers with disabilities, gate agents who patiently helped confused travelers navigate complex connections, and ground crew members who treated lost luggage incidents as personal missions rather than bureaucratic inconveniences. The stories that reached his executive office painted a picture of systematic transformation that went far beyond compliance with new policies to encompass genuine cultural change rooted in understanding that every passenger carried their own story, their own struggles, and their own reasons for choosing Sterling Airlines for their journey. A maintenance supervisor in Atlanta had written to thank management for training that helped him recognize when passengers needed extra assistance, while a customer service representative in Seattle shared how the new approach had turned a potentially explosive complaint into a loyal customer relationship that generated positive reviews across social media platforms. The quarterly customer satisfaction surveys reflected this transformation in numbers that spoke louder than any individual anecdote. Sterling Airlines had achieved the highest customer service ratings in company history, with particular strength in categories measuring respectful treatment, employee helpfulness, and overall passenger dignity throughout the travel experience. Industry publications had begun featuring Sterling Airlines as a case study in customer service excellence, with aviation analysts noting that the carrier had somehow managed to improve both employee morale and passenger satisfaction simultaneously, creating a virtuous cycle that generated positive word-of-mouth marketing worth millions of dollars in advertising value. Robert understood that this cultural transformation represented more than improved business metrics or competitive advantages in the marketplace, but rather the fulfillment of his original vision for an airline that proved profitable success and human decency were not mutually exclusive goals, but complementary forces that strengthened each other when properly aligned. As Robert Mitchell sat in his executive office overlooking the bustling tarmac of Sterling Airlines headquarters, surrounded by the awards and accolades that marked 4 decades of building something meaningful from humble beginnings, he reflected on the profound lesson that had emerged from Jessica Sterling's dramatic fall and ultimate redemption on that unforgettable flight from Chicago to Miami. The incident had crystallized a truth he had always known but never articulated so clearly: that true character is never revealed by the designer clothes we wear, the expensive accessories we carry, or the prestigious titles we hold, but rather by how we treat other human beings when we believe no one important is watching. When we think our actions will have no consequences, and when we assume that basic kindness is optional rather than essential. Jessica's transformation from an arrogant, appearance-obsessed flight attendant into a genuine advocate for human dignity had proven that even the most deeply ingrained prejudices could be overcome through humility, hard work, and the willingness to see every person as worthy of respect, regardless of their circumstances. The cultural revolution that had swept through Sterling Airlines served as powerful evidence that organizational change was possible when leaders committed themselves to values that transcended profit margins and competitive advantages to embrace the fundamental truth that business success and human decency were not competing priorities but complementary forces that strengthened each other. Robert had learned that his undercover evaluations revealed far more than customer service statistics or employee performance metrics, but rather the essential character of his organization and its commitment to treating every passenger as a valuable human being deserving of kindness and consideration. The story of Flight 447 had become legendary throughout the aviation industry, but its true power lay not in its dramatic revelation or satisfying comeuppance, but in its reminder that we are all being evaluated every day by the people around us, and that our character is measured not by how we treat those who can help us, but by how we treat those who seemingly cannot. So the next time you encounter someone who looks different, dresses differently, or seems to come from different circumstances than your own, remember that you never know who might be watching your behavior, who that person really is beneath the surface, or what story they carry with them. Treat everyone you meet with respect, kindness, and dignity, because true character is revealed not in moments of convenience, but in how we choose to see and serve others when we think it doesn't matter.